Hot off the back of their success with the Xbox 360, Microsoft began working on its successor, the Xbox One. Codenamed Durango, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the work started on the new console, but it was known to be in development as of at least May 2011, and likely at least a year or more before that. The Xbox One was a noticeable shift in philosophy from its predecessor, in more ways than one. Internally, the hardware moved from being PowerPC based back to the x86 architecture used by the original Xbox. AMD once again provided the main internal components of the system, with an 8-core AMD Jaguar APU being the heart of the console. This was paired with 8GB of DDR3 RAM, 5 of which was available for use in games, with the other 3 being for the operating system and background functions. Blu-ray was chosen to be the medium of choice for games moving forward. Sony had shown with the PS3 that it was the clear winner for storage, offering up huge amounts of disk space for games and movies compared to the aging DVD format, something that became increasingly more necessary as resolutions and graphical fidelity grew. A 500GB hard drive provided internal storage for the console at launch. While pretty small by current standards, was still a considerable amount of space in 2013 when the machine launched. Games didn't start to grow to colossal sizes for a couple of years, and as such was perfectly reasonable, at least to begin with. However, nearly 140GB of the 500 available was used by the operating system, effectively only making it a 360GB hard drive. This was somewhat remedied in 2014 when a system update allowed for external USB hard drive to be connected and used to store games, alleviating storage limitations caused by growing install sizes somewhat. The new controller was an evolution of that used by the Xbox 360. It featured a new, refined shape while maintaining largely the same layout. Small upgrades such as textured grips on the thumbsticks and a D-pad that wasn't terrible were nice to have. Start and Select, two mainstays of controllers for decades at this point, changed to View and Menu buttons. Fundamentally the same, just now the new icon and name. Microsoft reportedly spent north of $100 million developing the new controller, investing a huge amount of time and money developing prototypes and features, most of which were all dropped due to either having a negative effect on battery life or comfort, or just not being very good in general. One idea that did make it to the final design were the impulse triggers. The left and right triggers each had a small vibration motor behind them that allowed developers to program in extra rumble features when used. For example, when firing a gun or locking a wheel in Forza. It's nowhere near as advanced or detailed as the haptics found in the PS5 DualSense controller, but considering it predated it by nearly a decade, it was a really cool feature to have that was sadly not utilised anywhere near enough. The new console was officially announced to the world on May 21st, 2013, at a press conference from the Xbox headquarters in Redmond, Washington, and given the name of Xbox One. This event has become infamous for being one of the biggest missteps in gaming history. At the time, Don Mattrick was head of Xbox, a veteran of electronic arts for 15 years, who joined Microsoft in 2007 as Senior Vice President, with the specific intent of overseeing the Xbox brand and their PC gaming efforts, who after his success with the Kinect on Xbox 360 was promoted to the President of the Interactive Entertainment business. He took to the stage and promptly revealed the new console. It's from about this point in the show that things started to fall apart. Despite being the reveal of a new games console, the first 30 minutes of the hour-long event were dedicated to entertainment features such as TV, streaming and sports, and even the first game shown were the usual annual sports franchises from EA. It wasn't until 35 minutes into the show when Phil Spencer took to the stage that any Microsoft IP was shown. The rumours that had been swirling around about Microsoft's new console being an always online device were conveniently ignored, as were the murmurs about used games and a new DRM restricting their use. It wasn't totally devoid of cool features. A split-screen option called Snap Mode was announced. This allowed for having a browser or other app open while watching a movie or playing a game. It was unfortunately killed off midway through the console's life in 2017, however. A price for Microsoft's new console, as well as a release date and the reveal of some actual games, took place shortly after at that year's E3 in June. It was here that many of the gaming community's fears regarding the Xbox One were made reality. A new form of DRM was announced that stated all content would be bound to an Xbox Live account, including physical copies of games. The console would have to phone home at least once every 24 hours, otherwise all content would be disabled. Furthermore, physical games could only be traded in and resold if the game's publisher had enabled it at their end. This would have effectively killed the pre-owned market and raised a lot of red flags regarding future preservation. Even Sony raised an eyebrow, quickly memeing on Microsoft at their press conference during the same event by showing how easy it was to share a game on PS4.
Thanks.
Ironically, the world envisioned for Xbox isn't all that far away from what we have today, with always online connectivity required in many games and the physical market slowly dying out. Some of this was backtracked on almost immediately. Xbox's DRM policy was somewhat reversed, with Microsoft announcing that plans for the limits on lending and reselling of physical games were to be scrapped, along with any mandatory requirements for an internet connection. The controversial decision to require a Kinect to be always plugged into the console and listening to the user was dropped, due to some pretty valid privacy concerns.
But I want to feel comfortable talking about the Xbox in front of it. I might unguardedly say, I hope Xbox doesn't nuke the Chinese, and then who knows what might happen.
Mattrick dismissed most of these claims initially, as well as the lack of the console's backwards compatibility as not being a problem, showing what he thought of the consumer base in the process.
And fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right.
Mere 2 weeks following E3, Mattrick announced that he was leaving Microsoft to become the CEO of Zynga. It was never officially confirmed, but it's widely believed that the enormous backlash and negative press his vision for Xbox brought was the cause for him leaving. The Xbox One launched almost simultaneously worldwide on November 22nd, 2013, with only Japan and China having to wait to get their hands on the new console almost a year later. Releasing at $500, $100 more than the PS4 that released a week earlier, apparently didn't hurt initial sales all that much, with Microsoft announcing that by the end of the year, over 3 million consoles had been sold. While this was over 1 million less than the PS4, considering all of the controversies, wasn't that bad. This was likely helped by a relatively strong lineup of games available on day one. Forza Motorsport 5, Dead Rising 3, and Rise Son of Rome were all Xbox exclusives, backed up by next-gen versions of Assassin's Creed 4 and Call of Duty Ghosts, as well as the usual helping of sports and kids games. The Xbox One's game library was similar to that in size and scope of the PlayStation 4. Most titles that arrived on one platform eventually arrived on the other, aside from the obvious first-party exclusives. Microsoft's own first-party games were generally not considered to be on the same level as Sony's throughout the generation. Halo 5 and Gears of War 4 were front and centre and were well received, as were new entries in both the mainline Forza Motorsport and Horizon series. Many of the IP Microsoft had built up and collected throughout the Xbox and Xbox 360 years lay dormant for most of, if not all of the Xbox One's life. Series such as Fable had new entries planned, but ultimately had them cancelled for one reason or another. And development houses like Rare sat on a mountain of names that never saw the light of day beyond the re-release of old titles through Rare Replay. Backwards compatibility, or rather the Xbox One's lack of it, was something that was initially planned for the system at launch. However, Mattrick canned the feature, seeing it that was something that was not worth the time or money investments. It was later announced by Phil Spencer at E3 2015, with over 100 games planned to be supported. This was expanded on over the next couple of years, with more Xbox 360 games and the addition of original Xbox games, now with over 630 games being playable on the Xbox One from previous generations. In June of 2017, Xbox Game Pass went live for Xbox One consoles. The premise was remarkably simple, a sort of Netflix but for games. A large curated list of titles, including day one releases of big first-party games like Forza and Gears, all available for a relatively small monthly subscription. Games could be downloaded to the console and played exactly as if it had been bought. This model has largely been copied by most of the big publishers throughout the industry, with Sony, Nintendo, EA and Ubisoft all having their own iterations of the service, making games more accessible than ever before. Over the course of the Xbox One's lifetime, several different models and hardware revisions were released. In 2016, the Xbox One S hit stores, a smaller, sleeker design dressed in white that was upgraded in several areas. Most notably was the addition of playback for 4K Blu-rays and upscaling of content, including games, to 4K. This obviously isn't quite as nice as being rendered at true 4K resolution, but it was nice to have nonetheless if you had a compatible TV. Furthermore, the One S was HDR10 compatible, unlike the launch model, so again, if you had a compatible TV, you could take advantage of the nicer image quality. Several versions of the One S were available at its launch, with the difference between each one being the amount of storage included. 500GB, 1TB and 2TB versions were all available and started at $300. The only real downside to the One S was the removal of the Kinect port at the rear, so so if you wanted to use one with the machine, you need to purchase an adapter first. Microsoft discontinued the launch VCR model a year later, and as such the One S became the de facto model available. A digital version of the Xbox One S was released in 2019 that came bundled with 3 digital games: Forza Horizon 3, Sea of Thieves, and Minecraft. This version of the console ran alongside the main model, priced $50 cheaper to account for the lack of a disc drive. Aside from that limitation though, it was exactly the same as the main One S model. 2017 saw a third revision of the Xbox One released in the form of the Xbox One X. This new version of the console was significantly more powerful than the S model, with a CPU running slightly higher clock speeds and more RAM available to be used by games, for a roughly 30% performance uplift. This allowed supporting games to be played in true 4K and stabilised performance for a lot of older games that struggled to hit their frame rate cap on the older models. Releasing at $500, it was an expensive upgrade to the now relatively cheap S model, but it improved on it in pretty much every way. The Xbox One was a console that felt like it was doomed to fail from the very start. From the disastrous reveal and the controversies that surrounded it, to the fact that it regularly underperformed in some way when playing games, Call of Duty Ghosts, a launch game on both Sony and Microsoft systems, notoriously only ran at 720p on the Xbox One, while being full 1080p on the PS4. Negativity that surrounded the console was definitely a factor that made me choose the PlayStation for most of this generation, not picking up an Xbox One until 2017, when it had started to find its feet a little more. Despite all of this, the Xbox One sold relatively well, at least compared to the Wii U anyway, shifting around 60 million units across its 7-year lifespan. Not a bad number at all until you realise that the PS4 sold double that. The re-inclusion of backwards compatibility and introduction of Game Pass made multiple generations of games more accessible than ever before, and it's a net improvement for the game industry. Some genuinely great games were released for the Xbox One, and thankfully most of these are still playable today. Its successor, the Xbox Series line of consoles, are fully backwards compatible, and the games are now cheaper than ever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving it a like and subscribing if you'd like to see more videos like this. Did you get an Xbox One, or did you stick with the PS4 this generation? Let me know down in the comments.